right, welcome everybody to today's seminar in the Department of City and Regional Planning's lecture series, What is the Future of Commons Research and Policy? My name is Linda Shai. I'm an assistant professor in the department, and it is my honor to welcome our guests today, Dr. Mark Lubell and Xavier Basurto, to our talk. Before we get started, I would like to recognize that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation people. The Cayuga, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on the land. This confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Cayuga dispossession and honor the ongoing connection to the Cayuga people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And in recognition of in a way, this opening ties very much to the conversation that we're having today about the future of commons research and policy, because historically, in a way, all land is in the commons. What is the commons except the definition of humanity on Earth, or even all human and non-human species? So the fact that we even have a concept of the commons is really because there is a relation between this particular commons notion and the concept of the private, and that there is a body that can be incorporated as separate and distinct from the commons. And with each of these concepts, there are sets of theories and assumptions as to why they exist, as the paper that Xavier has shared for today amply demonstrates. Oftentimes, the commons is associated with something that is out there in rural areas, natural resources related for either agriculture, fisheries, natural resource management, or watershed governance. Whereas in cities, we have schemes that are much more privatized, privately owned, and many of the development agencies go around the world trying to promulgate more private land ownership mechanisms. Schemes about the commons, theories about the commons commonly associate, with Garret Hardin's notion of the tragedy of the commons, that if there is a commons that is unmanaged, then there will be a race to the bottom and an exploitation of natural resources. Whereas in the sense that if there is private property, there will be a more efficient and judicious governance of those resources. In reality, as Daniel Bromley and Bruce Larson noted back in 1990, dividing the land into parcels controlled by private property regimes will not necessarily reduce or eliminate the technical interdependence that exists between and among the users. And over time, we have seen that the prevalence of private property regimes has certainly not done anything to reduce the challenges of sustainable resource management, or even of collective reduction of conflict. And so the question of scale and of the commons as both a kind of concept of who owns the land, as well as the institutions that organize themselves and have to engage in the management of these different territories. Last week we had Julian Argument, who quoted Patsy Healy in saying that planning is about living together in shared space. So in this kind of shared space that we all live in, how do we manage the land ownership and also the governance across these different complex institutions? If anything, the crises of 2020 have really raised new interest in the possibilities of the commons. Anything from the tenants in Minneapolis who evicted their landlord to take ownership of a building in a cooperative, to debates about crises of climate change, sea level rise, and wildfire, raising questions of what do we owe each other. And mutual aid certainly extends to our response to COVID. What is our responsibility at the individual level, the community, and even upwards to the nation state? And so in this moment of collective pain, there's also this question of what kind of collective action do we engage in? And so we have with us today 2 researchers who have long delved into these issues and also shown that the commons and the collective is by no means any more a panacea than the private and the market. And they're all the common and the collective is rife also with issues of gender, power, leadership, control, among other issues. And simply reducing it to a smaller level of governance does not necessarily change those contentions. So today we have Dr. Xavier Basurto. He is the Associate Professor of Sustainability Science within the Division of Marine Science and Conservation at Duke University. He's also the Director of Coasts and Commons Collaboratory. Trained as a marine biologist at the ITESM campus of Guaymas in Mexico, Dr. Basurto completed a Master's in Science and Natural Resources studying small-scale fisheries in the Gulf of California, Mexico. Realizing the need to bring social science theories into his work on common pool resource sustainability, he earned an MPA and a PhD in management with a minor in cultural anthropology from the University of Arizona. He then spent 2 years working with Elinor Ostrom, the 2009 co-winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, at the Workshop for Political Theory and Policy Analysis of Indiana University. He is interested in the fundamental question of how groups, human and non-human, find ways to self-organize, cooperate, and engage in successful collective action for the benefit of the common good. To do this, he strives to understand how the institutions, formal and informal rules and norms that govern social behavior interplay with biophysical variables to shape socio-ecological systems. What kinds of institutions are better able to govern complex adaptive systems? And how can societies, large and small, develop robust institutions that provide enough flexibility and for collective learning and adaptation over the long term? Methodologically, he is familiar with a variety of quantitative and qualitative approaches and formally trained to conduct qualitative comparative analysis that allows for, among other things, the systematic comparisons of middle range n sample sizes and address issues of multiple causality. We also have Professor Mark Lubell, who is professor and vice chair at the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis, and the director of the Center for Environmental Policy and Behavior. His research focuses on human behavior and the role of governance institutions in solving collective action problems and facilitating cooperation. Many of the things that he's interested in include watershed management, environmental activism, agricultural best management practices, and institutional change in local governments. He says he also dabbles in experimental economics and simulation techniques to further explore collective action theory. Following a natural science model of scientific inquiry, his long-term research agenda is to discover common principles of collective action that can be observed and tested in all three modes of research: theory, experiment, and field. He is the author of 91 articles and author or editor of 2 books, including the 2017 Oxford Handbook of Political Networks and from 2005, Swimming Upstream: Collaborative Approaches to Watershed Management. He has a BA in Political Science from UC San Diego, a Master's in Political Science from SUNY Stony Brook, and a PhD in Political Science from SUNY Stony Brook as well as a minor in Political Psychology and Quantitative Methodology. Alviano, if you could post the websites for each of the faculty members. They have very cool designs of their websites that I admire. And then there are also readings linked to their papers that they have shared. One from Mark that has been published in 2013, I believe, and one from a team led by a PhD student of Javier's that has just been accepted at the International Journal of the Commons. Today, we'll have each of them present for about 20 minutes in response to these questions. As longtime researchers of natural resource commons, how do you respond to urgent calls for policy change and critical reflexivity in research? What does this research offer to us in this current moment of change? And how has research on the commons changed over time? And how does it need to evolve moving forward? They'll each talk for about 20 minutes, drawing on their research. We'll have some more time for questions among the 3 of us, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. I invite you to submit questions in the chat as we go along. Finally, I want to thank our coordinators and organizers, Chris Hinman and Alviano Stinson, for running the show basically, and to the department for making it possible for us to invite our 2 speakers today. Javier, do you want to take over?
Yes, let me share my screen. First of all, thank you, Linda, for the kind invitation. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you, your students, and Mark, who I've known a long time, but it's the first time we get to interact this way. So I'm very thankful and very excited. So I would like to share with you work that, if I have time, two pieces of work that are representative of the work we're doing in our group. And the first one is the work, as you mentioned, led by Hilary Smith, a PhD candidate, ABD. And this is one of the chapters of her dissertation. And it's indicative of what we think is the need to rethink certain concepts that have been very important in development of commons theory and at the core of developing ideas of institutional analysis, kind of in the Ostrom tradition, that, as I say, have been very useful in creating a body of knowledge. But as they've been used, they've become rigid and rigid with implicit assumptions that are harder to see as the concepts get redefined and redefined. And so in this paper, we take on the idea of scale, and we're publishing an international journal of the commons. What I will say, it's my my community, to encourage my colleagues to rethink scale, the assumptions it carries without thinking anymore, and how to move forward. Alejandro Garcia is another PhD student in my lab, and Lisa Campbell is a colleague of mine. She's in my department. So let's start with an influential paper in the Commons literature, led by Clark Gibson at the beginning of the 2000s, now more than 20 years ago, where he and his colleagues were arguing for the need of clear, well-defined concepts and scale. They said it's composed of multiple and discrete levels that are linked. Levels are hierarchically ordered and nested. And this was an effort to bring a common language among different folks interested in the commons, coming from different disciplines, but also out of an increased interest in the interaction with ecologists, so that problems of common pool resource management or governance, of natural resource governance, could be more easily addressed. So in the paper, we examined three assumptions about scale. One is that a scale has become, or when you talk about scale, is implicit the assumption of size. The other is that it's implicit notion of having bounded levels. And the other one is that it's hierarchically ordered. So let me describe a little bit what we mean by each assumption. So equivalent scale being equivalent to size, I can give you the example of small scale fisheries, where it's an issue I'm very interested on. The governance in fisheries in general is literally divided between small-scale fishing and large-scale fishing. So scale has become about size. And there's a lot of debates that each has very different characteristics and should be treated, governed very differently. The issue, this implicit notion that scale has this embedded meaning of size, has had policy consequences. This is just a table of national definitions of what is small-scale fishing, where countries now argue that to determine what is small-scale fishing, Brazil, for instance, says that it's any vessel less than 18 meters large. Cambodia is about horsepower. So for some, it's about length of the vessel. For others, it's about the weight of the vessel. For others, it's about the size of the engine. And this has important implications, for instance, for the assignment of subsidies. Right now at the WTO, there's a big debate about this issue. How do you define fisheries, small scale or large scale, for the assignment of these subsidies? And just to mention that this is the second chapter in the dissertation of Hilary, where we examine the implications of how fisheries are defined. The other implicit assumption when we talk about scale is having bounded levels. What do I mean by that? That when you think of scale as levels, this can lead the analyst to select a level a priori and then identify how it intersects with other levels. With repetition, entities appear as if already contained with certain levels and are often assumed to be relatively homogeneous. And so these levels share some kind, might come to be seen as sharing some kind of cohesion and similarity. So in the commons literature, but also in the community-based management literature, the idea, for instance, that there's the local level, and the local level has this inherent characteristic. So we don't question these characteristics anymore because local level has come to mean small is beautiful or static and authentic. A community, the local level where fishes are interacting with the ocean is seen as authentic, but also as a slow changing, as where old traditions are kept. While the global level is come to seen as fluid and dynamic. So this might be right, but also it might be wrong in the sense that these characteristics that are embedded in seeing scale as having discrete, made up of discrete levels, come with certain notions about the characteristics of these levels. And this is the work of Gibson and Graham and Singh, some critical human geographers. Finally, scale as being hierarchically ordered, as in Russian matryoshka dolls, right? Where if you think of scale as having hierarchy, then it's easy to think of scale as having a top and a bottom. And implicitly having a top, let's say, size, agency, or power, will have more than the bottom. The bottom will have less size, less agency, and less power. And again, this might be a correct notion. So, for instance, if we see fisheries policy from a hierarchical lens, we see the U.S. Congress in the top of the hierarchy, creating laws about fisheries, and then the state of Alaska also having some policy hierarchy over the salmon fishery. And again, this might be right, but this might be wrong, and this should be empirically verified, which is harder to do when we're making this implicit assumption. So this is what we try to examine in the paper. And so we create this typology for common scholars to disentangle the production of scale through the lens of three distinct dimensions and moments of action. And so in this table, we present the different dimensions of scale on the left, the moments of action, some reflective questions that we as researchers should make to ourselves, and empirical questions. And I'm not going to have time to go through the empirical questions, but to give you a flavor of what we mean by dimensions of scale, we have the operational dimension of scale, which is related to the physical properties of things and the biophysical and social phenomena that we experience and perceive as real. And then by the observational dimension, we mean the one that arises as an attribute of how the researcher, the analyst, observes something. And finally, the interpretive dimensions of scale is the translation of complex relationships into forms that are generalizable and affective being a keyword, and have normative implications that tell us how we should feel of what should be done. So the moments of action that we simplify, for instance, for the dimension of the operational dimension, is that comes with the everyday interaction with the world and the ordering of things and rhythms of life. And the reflective questions is, how do my own everyday understanding of scale shapes my perception of the commons and my research? Well, the observational dimension is produced through moments of observation, measurement, as the parameters within which phenomena are examined are set. So for reflexive questions, we have to ask ourselves, do the parameters I choose to observe and measure the commons affect what is visible or invisible in my research? Do my everyday experiences of scale impact my choice of observational scale? And finally, the interpretive dimension is the one that is produced using interpretive devices, metaphors, storylines, abstract models that communicate what aspects of scale relationships matter or don't matter. So we should ask ourselves, what normative hierarchies am I invoking through my choice of interpretive devices, and what are their effects? And we could argue that this is just sound research design, right? And finally, so in the paper, we provide a way to move forward for common scholars, practical steps to critically rethink scale. And so the first is to ask ourselves, what assumptions am I making about scale? The second is, what dimensions of scale can I identify? Can I identify the moments where different dimensions of scale are enacted to produce scale or rescale? And finally, what are the limits, the trade-offs inherent in my chosen approach to scale, and what are the alternatives? So that in a nutshell is the paper. We provide examples, empirical examples to illustrate, but I just want to give you a flavor of the type of work we argue it's important to do forward in the future in relation to building theory of the commons. How much time I have, Linda?
You have about another 10 minutes.
Okay, so let me share with you to answer another question that you posed. This is work that we're doing to answer more typical questions that have been of the interest of institutional analysis in relation to the commons and the performance of institutions. So here we were trying to understand why some fishing cooperatives work better than others in Mexico. And so to answer, in Mexico fishing is organized around fishing cooperatives, but essentially are like any other type of cooperative, workers band together to solve collective action problems and to pool resources and benefit from collective action. So here, this is an example where we partnered with the industry, the National Confederation of Fishing Cooperatives, to co-produce this study. Yeah, so I just explained this or mentioned this. And so in the co-production of this study, we were trying to understand, okay, which characteristics matter for successful collective action that affect performance in the sense of well-functioning fishing cooperatives. And so we brought lessons from the work of Elinor Ostrom, but also from asking the fishers, in your experience, why some cooperatives work better than others? What are the characteristics that those cooperatives have? And so we engage, as I mentioned, with CONMECOP, the National Confederation of Fishing Cooperatives. They represent more than 11,000 fishers. And we sat with them to discuss why they would be interested in a study like this, why I was interested in a study like this. Mine was more about theory building. For them was like, well, we want to understand what kind of services we need to provide to our membership. And civil society NGOs were also involved. For them was to push fisheries reform. So from the beginning of expressing our motivations to engage with each other, made the collaboration easier. And so we engage with the leaders of confederations are made up federations, and federations are made up cooperatives. So we engage with the leaders of the federations, folks that have a lot of experience organizing and that they know, they interact with their cooperatives within their federation. And they provided us with a list of 54 independent variables. And so we poured this into a national standardized survey to try to tease out these issues. And so you can see the lengthy focus groups we did with these folks until we had a survey we could rely on. And so we then went around the country talking to leaders of cooperatives. Now, if I had done it my way, in terms of the academic way, the study would have been much more expensive and I would have reached far less fishers. By working with the Confederation, they said, no, 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 this is the way to do it. We're going to select 6 regions in the country, and we're going to call fishers to come to these regions because we're going to, we're going to call them. You're going to pay for the expenses, but we're going to call them. And this, of course, introduced some biases, but also some advantages. And so this is an example of the leaders of the Confederation in one of these regions talking to the presence of the cooperatives, why they were there, why this study was important, and asking for their cooperation in answering our survey. And of course, for them, it was important to be there, to be seen, and to promoting it. There was a lot of advantages for them to be seen. But and then we went on to do our work of, interviewing these folks. So again, this is just a flavor of the co-production of a study of this sort, where right now we're analyzing the data and we're preparing manuscripts showing which characteristics of fishing cooperatives seem to be associated to performance. Yeah, and finally, this also gives us the opportunity. If we hadn't worked with the fishers, we would have not have access to high-level policymakers in Mexico that then were more motivated to hear about our study and our findings than if had been just an academic study. Yeah, so that in a nutshell is what I can share to start the conversation about the 2 aspects of our work in Mexico related to the commons and institutional analysis of the commons. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Javier. You have a few minutes left of your time, so I wondered if I could ask a question, which is to ask you to connect the first half of your presentation to the second half of your presentation. And if you were to then more critically reflect on the role of theorizing of scale in this actual research project, did this research and the findings that you have developed change somehow your understanding of scale, or the hierarchy of scale, or the false equivalency of scale as being equal to size and power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, we conducted the work with the fishing cooperatives before we wrote this paper. So it was working with fishing cooperatives at the different, at the different levels. So here I'm using levels. Cooperatives, federations, and the Confederation that started to allow us to think, okay, can we assume that some actually cooperatives are less powerful than some federations? And where's scale in this? We were attending the General Annual Assembly of the Confederation, where the leaders of the Confederation were interacting with the Federation, were interacting with cooperatives, and they were all equally. The power was expressed more in their ability to articulate and provide images and discourses. And so it's like, this leader of the cooperative, it's actually more powerful than the president of the federation to which he belongs in this moment. So we started to rethink some assumptions that we were making coming into this study, just because cooperatives are contained within a federation and that federation is contained within the confederation. The leaders of the confederation are powerful because they interact with the president of the country or the senators. In this picture, this is the president of the confederation and this is a senator, and they're laughing. There's been a joke has been said, and I think a joke has been said by somebody in the audience, which it was either a president of the federation or president of the cooperative. And so in that moment, which I will call a moment of commoning, which is another interesting concept, where they're really kind of sharing a moment of being together. I don't see any hierarchies anymore here. So in our paper of scale, we we call attention to these moments because it's those moments where scale is produced or disappears. And so we should be more attentive to those moments, if and ask ourselves if they have any analytical meaning, for our research, because that's where that might be important in either the production of power. In maybe after this joke, it was easier to come to a common understanding about something that without that joke it would have been hard to agree on. Does that have analytical power or not? I don't know, but we should ask. And if we are more implicitly assuming that the decision needs to come from the president of the Confederation because he's the most powerful in the group, in the sector of fisheries, we might miss this moment as being catalytic to collective action, to successful collective action.
Thanks so much. Mark? I think, Javier, you have to end sharing, and then Mark can share.
I end? Yeah, okay.
One moment.
And again, when you're listening in, feel free to start typing questions, and I'll pull from those in the Q&A.
Is that working?
Yep.
All right, well, thanks so much for the invitation and the kind introduction, and Javier, awesome presentation. I've got some questions for you about it. So in my talk, I'm going to kind of more directly attack the charge that was laid out by Linda for this particular seminar. So what is the future of commons research? And I'm going to argue that the future of commons research is really messy. So when you look at the, just making sure before I continue here to make sure that, all right, seeing the chat, make sure everything technically is okay. So when you look at a lot of the work that I've been doing recently is on these complex polycentric governance systems where you have lots of actors, lots of different policy forums, lots of collective action problems, linked collective action problems all happening at the same time. So it's not just like just a fishery problem. It's a fishery problem plus a water supply problem plus a water quality problem, biodiversity problem, other problems that come up. They're all linked together, governed by multi-level complex governance systems that are really quite messy. In response to one of my articles about this, see this top quote up here: public policy is almost always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage a messy situation. And these are situations where nobody is in charge, but everybody is involved, and figuring out how to manage and govern those situations is nearly impossible. And this is a quote from a guy named Phil Eisenberg, who's a real veteran of California water. And at the same time, Ostrom, in her Nobel address, wrote, to explain the world of interactions and outcomes occurring at multiple levels, we also have to be willing to deal with complexity instead of rejecting it. So I think of this research that I'm doing around the messiness of environmental governance and polycentric governance as pretty much trying to do the impossible and trying to figure out how to manage these messes. So what do these messes look like? Let's see if I can get this thing to work. There we go. Okay, so you can there's lots of ways to do this, but a methodology I commonly use is network analysis. So this is the ecology of games, or the polycentric governance system around the California Delta, which is one of the most important watersheds in the West. Well, it is, I would argue, the most important watershed in the West Coast from a water management perspective, and definitely in California. All the blue squares here are different policy venues or forums in which collective decision-making is occurring, and all the red circles are different sorts of organizations, multiple sorts of stakeholders participating in those policy forums, making collective decisions. So you see there's over 100 different policy forums operating simultaneously in the California Delta, governing how the common pool resources of the water of that ecosystem is managed. If you zero in on that, you can see some of the central actors. For example, you see a program called CalFed, which is actually now changed to something called the Delta Stewardship Council, which is one of our most famous collaborative governance examples that lots of people use in their research. But CalFed is surrounded by, what is there, something like 20 other collaborative looking venues and lots of actors. The red actors here are often state and federal agencies. So there are questions. These are definitely multi-scale systems, and Xavier is exactly right that thinking about scale is crucial here. So what I've done in some of my work in the paper I forwarded to you guys is develop basically a theoretical framework to try to explain how cooperation, learning, and bargaining happen in the context of these complex systems. I call it the ecology of games framework. It borrows, well, steals, honestly, the term developed by a sociologist named Norton Long, wrote a paper in 1957 about the urban systems as from an ecology games perspective. So I take what he wrote and kind of throw in some Ostrom and some complex adaptive systems and some policy theory and shake that all up and come up with this ecology of games framework, which looks at the fact, for example, this is just like a small bit of it, where you have two collective action problems, one forum governing both, but you explode that up into that big system, and that's the sort of systems that I'm looking at in the networks. I think there's three core governance processes in the systems: learning, figuring out what the problems are, the solutions are, what the policy preferences are of other actors; cooperation, which is the classic thing in the commons; and distribution. How do you figure out how to bargain over the resources, the procedural and distributional fairness of that bargaining? So I like the fact that there's only three, I kind of identify three core governing processes because there's not 10, right? There's only three that you have to think about. But it's not just cooperation, it's these other pieces as well. So there's a series of papers, I'm not going to go through all these obviously, but there's a whole series of papers, and this isn't all of them because more are coming out, that we've written that have been spawned by this ecology of games framework. A lot of them applied to regional water governance, comparative. We work in some in Argentina, in the Paraná Delta, Tampa Bay, San Francisco Bay, but we're expanding to sea level rise now and lots of other issues. People are citing this stuff in kind of exotic places, like there's a series of papers on the development of talent in Norwegian handball. And then soccer referees, that's my favorite, the development of international soccer referee systems, citing this work. So Ramiro Berardo, my co-author, and I are both huge soccer fans. So when we found out that our framework was applied to international soccer, we decided we should probably retire because we've reached the pinnacle. So if you believe me, and I think if you just take a moment to reflect on your own research in urban areas or in fisheries, you will realize that, that even those cooperatives that Xavier studies are nested in the extremely complex polycentric systems. And that, I think, basically everywhere you look, that's what that's what the reality of common pool resource governance is. It's these really messy systems. So if you take that as the starting point, let's turn to the seminar questions. And I flipped them a little bit because I like the first one to start it out. So how has research in the commons changed over time? How does it need to evolve? How do you respond to the urgent calls for policy change and critical reflexivity? And what does this research offer us in this current moment of change when we're looking at issues of social justice in particular? Critical reflection on Hardin and his ideology with respect to scholarship on the commons. And so I'm going to go through these three questions and for each one, I'm just going to give a super fast sample of some research that I've done that I think speaks to each of these questions. And I will warn you from the outset that I'm not going to go into depth in any of the research. So there may be a lot of clarifying questions that you might want to ask me about each of them afterwards. So what do we need to change? So I think that Ostrom, when she passed away, was amazing person. I mean, she literally was getting published stuff after she passed away. I don't know how that happens, but she did. But I think two of the big gauntlets that she left for us is these idea of institutional fit, that there's no one set of institutions that fits everywhere, and relatedly, there's no panacea. You can't just pick one particular set of policy tools and hope that it works everywhere. And if you take that seriously, that means that the structure of these polycentric systems is going to reflect the local social ecological context or the regional context, different political cultures, and that the different, it's not just polycentricity. You can't just say, oh, we're gonna make polycentric systems. That really doesn't work for me at all, because everything's polycentric. So what you really have to do is think about what are the ways in which polycentric systems vary over space and time, and how do you manage them to best fit the social ecological context. So that the whole perspective also means you have to think about scaling up from small scale common pool resources to the large scale of something like the California Delta or a coastal area like New York, New Jersey, where I'm doing sea level rise research and all the linked multiple collective action problems there. And we critically need comparative analysis over space and time. You know, Xavier is doing something very good, I think, by looking at multiple fishing cooperatives, because a lot of people and a lot of the research is based on one case study. But we know that these polycentric messy things change over space and time, reflecting local context, dynamics, possibly, you know, incremental versus punctuated equilibrium sorts of dynamics. But we really don't have much research or really any theory. Well, maybe a little theory, but not definitely a big lack of empirical research that's compared over space and time. And within that, a lot of people like Tiffany Morrison and others are thinking about, we have to think about power in those systems. What does it mean to have political power? Because we know that it's not just cooperation, it's also the bargaining part, the procedural fairness and the distributional fairness. So this just gives you an idea, why is it important to look at things over time? This is the sea level rise network in San Francisco Bay, which we basically split into 5 time periods: an early time period where there's a couple of regional forums and a set of regional actors that started thinking about sea level rise. And then quickly, as sea level rise became more salient, this network really exploded in terms of many more actors getting involved, many more venues being created at multiple scales. And so the interesting thing about this is that it's a regional problem. And a lot of people think we got to do regional sea level rise adaptation, but really what's happening to become regional here, it's actually a process of decentralization, downscaling of governance from the regional level to the local level. Xavier rightly points out that there's a lot of stuff that happens at the local level. And I would actually argue here in sea level rise adaptation, the most fluid things are happening at the local level, as bunches of local governments and special districts and whatnot, they're engaging in different projects, but they're not thinking about how it affects the region. Then the regional actors say, hey, we got to figure out how to get this everybody going in the same direction. All right, so that's the first question and one example. The second question, policy change and critical reflexivity. When you're thinking about how these systems evolve over time, what's happening is that these new problems, such as sea level rise or climate change adaptation or COVID or food security, these new collective action problems emerge, and the system responds. The system responds given the current baseline set of institutions and actors. They start building new forms, changing new forms. The complexity of the system changes. And that's an effective governance system is one that can kind of grapple with these new collective action problems as they're discovered and come online and start to affect people. But the way in which that happens is really depends a lot on political culture and the macro political institutional arrangement. So are we talking about a culture that is really emphasizes local autonomy, or are we talking about a political culture like in the Netherlands, for example, that's more comfortable with centralized institutions? And the macro level institutional, are we talking democracy? Are we talking about more hierarchical forms of government? That those all matter in terms of how these things, how these systems change over time. And there's trade-offs. So it's not just that these systems are learning and bargaining and cooperation. There's possible trade-offs among those over time, which sometimes where the system is learning, but it's negatively affected by the distributional questions. There's different parts of the system that have to deal with different parts of the problem, different parts of the processes. And so when you look at these systems, they're multifunctional. And a lot of people are just like, the system is built for one thing. No, it's not really built for one thing. It's built for solve multiple things and multiple processes. And within that, if you want to talk about the critical reflexivity part, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next question too, these questions of political power and social justice are really crucial. So this is just an example of the importance of different sorts of processes and also different sorts of political settings, political culture, social ecological systems. So what I have here is surveys of stakeholders involved in regional water governance in Tampa Bay, the California Delta, and the Paraná estuary in Argentina. And what we do is we ask all the stakeholders that we can get to answer a survey their perceptions about how well the system is doing on 4 different dimensions. You know, how well is the system doing in terms of solving the problem, affecting their interest, their specific interest, how fair is it, and what's the efficacy from a political, internal political efficacy standpoint. So 2 kind of outcome variables on the left of these graphs and 2 process variables on the right. And then we asked them as well, how well do you understand the interest of other actors, which is this political knowledge question. And then also, how well do you understand how good do you think the science is? So like, is the science good in the system or not? And the first thing you want to look at is that for the political knowledge questions, like how well do you understand the interests of the other actors, really matters for fairness and political efficacy. So the process-based ones, that's kind of the bargaining function of these things. And the scientific knowledge matters more for everything: fairness, efficacy, interest, and problem contribution. But you see, the scientific knowledge is particularly important in Tampa Bay and California, and less so in Paraná. So you got some sort of political system, political culture difference there. And then, but in Paraná, the political knowledge is really important. So you have 2 different things going on here about how political knowledge and scientific knowledge affect people's perception of the performance of these systems. One is process versus output, and one is the differences across these regions. And that sort of variance. Now, I would like to observe this instead of just Tampa Bay, California, Delta, and Paraná. I'd like to have 50, 60, 100 regions in which we could do a multi-level analysis of this. Then we'd really be getting somewhere. Okay, responding to the current moment is the third question. We have lots of new collective action problems, such as climate adaptation, but the current moment also makes us realize it's not just about the environment. We have climate and things like biosecurity, but now we have COVID, we have food security, we have homelessness. If you look in the Bay Area at climate adaptation, for example, COVID just accelerates and compounds those risks, and those risks are especially compounded in the context of disadvantaged communities. So I think, you know, some people think of it as the food, water, you know, energy nexus, but then there's a lot of nexuses that you can think about, and all of those potentially compound risk and interdependencies that then you have to scale up to deal with the whole system. And I think that those, at the very least, those risks are compounded in social and for disadvantaged communities. But you have to think about, as these systems evolve, is it going to exacerbate or mitigate this inequality? On the one hand, these systems work pretty well because there's lots of opportunities, and especially I think this is a strength of democracy. There's lots of opportunities to create new venues, create new policies, participate, lots of veto points. So that's like, it's rich in opportunities to participate and affect the system. On the other hand, in order to effectively get something done, it requires a lot of resources. You have to go to a lot of venues. you have to be able to be influential in those venues. And when you're talking about disadvantaged communities, there's structural racism, there's resource constraints and various other things that may limit their capacity to effectively participate in these messy systems. So one example from the environmental justice, social equity standpoint is sustainable groundwater management in California, which is something I'm working on. In 2014, we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. And what happened there is we took all the critical basins, the critically overdrafted basins in California, there's 127 of them, I think, and told these people working in those basins, the water users, to basically create new institutions from scratch. So it's this huge experiment in the creation of common pool resource management institutions. First, they had to form these things called groundwater sustainability agencies, which are like the local governing bodies, and then they had to come up with groundwater sustainability plans. But within each of those basins, you can see the map of it here, you have these disadvantaged communities, which are communities that are below a certain median income level in California. And their interests are supposed to be accounted for in the development of these agencies, of these groundwater sustainability agencies and these plans, but they have a lot of constraints about in terms of how they're able to participate. And the important thing from the messiness perspective is that it's not just SGMA. For example, there was another program before SGMA called Integrated Regional Water Management, which was more about water supply and trying to get, cooperation at the regional level, which also involved these disadvantaged communities. So a lot of them are basically saying, well, we were doing IRWM, that was hard for us, now we're being asked to do SGMA, and you just start multiplying that. There's lots of different policy processes that affect the interests of these disadvantaged communities, and it makes it hard for them we heard a lot of anecdotes. IRWM was great for us. We built relationships and it helped us with SGMA. Or IRWM, Integrated Regional Water Management, was terrible for us, and we were excluded, and that exclusion has made it harder for us to participate in SGMA. So in some of the research that we did, you can just see this graph here is basically out of all those GSAs that were formed, let's see, we've got 269 of these GSAs. The representation of those disadvantaged communities is quite small. So the one on the right, the really small bar graph, is basically saying there's very few of the disadvantaged communities that have some sort of formal representation in those GSAs as a seat on the board or a member of committees. And so that right there is a problem right away. Representation, procedural fairness. At the same time, when from previous research that I did, and this is from the Bay Area and IRWM, in the surveying of the Bay Area stakeholders that I did for this particular one, we asked them how well does IRWM do achieving these management goals, and you see there at the bottom, addressing disadvantaged communities. So you have two policy processes going on at the same time in California, that both of which have implications for disadvantaged communities, and both of which are struggling to adequately represent and address the concerns of those communities. So that's it. That's kind of the three that started with the idea that we got to deal with these messy polycentric systems. That's the reality of environmental governance. And I tried to trace through the implications of that for the three questions that were asked by Linda with examples from California and other places: regional water management, sea level rise adaptation, and groundwater management. And so hopefully that gives you some flavor of what I'm doing, and also some ideas about key things that we should look for in terms of Commons research going forward. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mark. Wonderful presentations from both of you, and we could really spend quite a lot of time talking. I mean, there's so many different concepts and theories that are really invoked in all your presentations. I'm going to just keep it very short in order to open it up for others. I have, I guess, one broader takeaway type of a question from these presentations, which is in both cases, you're talking about how messy it is to even conceptualize or then to engage in any of these changes. I mean, Mark, especially your network analysis diagrams, as you say, it's impossible when you look at all of these, and if that's just for water, then you layer on the healthcare, the land use, the transportation, all the other ones. It's like this matrix that has infinite possibilities and permutations and organizations involved with it. And so there is an academic challenge of even beginning to study and tease out threads of what is then the relevant mechanism of learning as opposed to cooperation, or power as opposed to rationality of institutions as opposed to actors. And yet from the actual empirical change of what is happening on the ground, you do see these moments where the policy side is forcing that change to take place. So it might be the conversations with the confederations of fisheries, or for instance, Mark, you know, in a way it's impossible to know what to do, and yet you guys passed this act that sort of like Big Bang asks everyone to create new institutions for governing groundwater in a very how that even was passed, how is that, what kinds of institutions are you asking people to form, what things do they actually form, does that provide some kind of, does the empirical source or the empirical evidence around institutional change, what does that teach us about the actual dynamics of what might work better, or when change can happen, under what circumstances it might create better common pool resource management?
You want me to take that on?
You can go and then Javier, I guess.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're talking about Sigma as this, it was a big moment in California water policy, and there was a long 4 or 5 year drought that kind of preceded it that really pushed things and made the actors react. But it wasn't the first time. There'd been multiple droughts in California before, and multiple attempts previously to establish stronger statewide groundwater management institutions. So they'd kind of like drought and then an incremental change, drought and an incremental change, drought and an incremental change. And then this, and you know, if it weren't for all those, I mean, it's literally, you know, 2 or 3 decades of kind of moving towards Sigma, Sigma would never have happened. I mean, I do think Sigma was a, you know, a landmark law that it was a bigger change than usual, but it was stimulated by drought. There was a basis of institutional change that had occurred to lead up to it. And really across the system, you had to have all the different actors at multiple levels agreeing, right? They had to kind of all be enough, not all, enough people being in agreement so that it was able to translate from local level support, from the leaders and the various networks all the way up to the legislature, so that the legislature would be able to pass, you know, have the political support and the political cover to pass such a law. So I think there's punctuations, there's incrementalism, there's focusing events, all of that plays into it. And you will see in the ecology of games theory that I lay out, there's a lot of discussion in relation to work by Baumgartner and Jones and whatnot on punctuated equilibrium and focusing events, which I think is another way of thinking of these systems.
Lynn, I think your question is very pertinent. I mean, it reminded me of, you know, work. I'm going to share my screen. We did with that Lynn Ostrom led on. We were trying to craft analytical tools to study institutional change, and we were essentially proposing what Mark is doing. At the core, it's important to understand what is changing, which is also the challenge, right? Because institutions might be completely invisible, particularly if they are informal, but recording and documenting over time how rules and norms change, I think it's at the core of building a general theory of institutional change. It's easier to work in more formalized environments than, you know, in the case of fishing, where there's actually, it's all informality, becomes, you know, heavy investment in the field, spending time more kind of anthropological work. But studying it from the level that Mark is studying it, and being able to use different analytical tools that allow you to get at change, spatial and temporal scale change, I think that will give us a lot of leverage to understand what is changing, and then link it to what are the processes that lead to that change, whether it is punctuated or is gradual, as I was describing in these moments, right? We are calling attention to the study of these moments that might seem inconsequential, but actually Ostrom made a big argument in her work in 1990, where she's talking about groundwater in Southern California and why some issues were able to be solved. She said, pay attention to institutional supply, how the state or some actors might be lowering the costs for other actors to engage in collective action. In the case of California, easy access to the courts was what allowed for people to come to the court, solve problems, define property rights, and move forward. Sharing space for having a meeting, like, hey, you can use this meeting room for you guys come together and discuss this issue about how you're going to measure water usage. So all these kind of issues that might be formal, like the courts, or informal, like, hey, use this space, whether it's a school, gymnasium, or whatever, to meet, lower the transaction costs, and eventually result in a policy change. Yeah. So there's so much to be said about. I agree with Mark that polycentrism is everywhere. So understanding what nodes and what is the structure that matters, it's at the core of understanding how rules change over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the rule change aspect is something that I think is there's people working on like the grammar of institutions using Ostrom's framework. And I definitely think that there's a really good opportunity to merge some of that work about like operationalizing the rules, measuring the rules in a more specific manner with what I'm doing, because all those different forums, they are all kind of, at the very least, they have collective choice rules, and they're producing lots of times operational rules that are potentially amenable to being studied with institutional grammar. The issue that I think is interesting is that the rules are all different, right? Across all those forums, they conflict with each other. Lots of the people that are writing the rules in one forum are completely unaware of what the rules are in the other forums. And so when you add all those rules up, you get lots of conflicts and lots of fragmentation. So you can't think of the system as like, some overarching planner has come and like, created this like synthetic set of rules that governs everything. It's this bubbling up type of process that's happening. And I think, the institutional grammar could definitely help us understand that, but it's not going to come out and say, hey, here's the system, and it looks like all this one set of rules that everybody obeys. Different interpretations, conflicting rules, but of course, that's what makes it interesting.
Interesting for us, but challenging for everybody who's actually working in those spaces and has to implement actions or live with the results, no? All right, let me open it up to Q&A. We have a couple questions. I urge others of you to continue submitting questions or raising your hand so that we can get it going, and also to turn on your videos since we are now in the discussion part, and it'll be nice to see your faces. All right, first up we have a question from Nidhi. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Basurto and Professor Lubell. Professor Basurto, I really admire how you've brought together these different fields and conversation with each other for institutional research. And I think in thinking with and through your work on fisheries and your earlier presentation, I was curious how you approach the agency of the non-human and its role in creating different scales of governance, even drawing on Anna Singh's work. And how do you think that might challenge, normative assumptions that planners and policymakers make, which tend to be very anthropocentric?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I saw it in the chat. Yeah, this is a challenging question. I mean, and we haven't. So you're asking how I'm implementing it in our work. We are still in the process of thinking how to do this. I mean, the agency of non-humans, species. I think the first step is to Common Pool Resources and the Commons has looked at fish as a resource, defining it as a resource. And it comes from economics, and it's useful sometimes to think it as a resource. But again, not all communities of fishers or cultures see it as a resource. So thinking the value scheme at which we are looking at fish, we actually just have a paper or a book or a chapter of thinking as fish more than a resource, allows to expand the value system at which that people are bringing into how they're using fish. And also allows us to expand the theory from only focusing on harvesting. If, Hardin's work influenced and other scholars a lot of common pool resource theory to solve the problem of open access and overexploitation. But that has narrowed the focus on harvesting, solving the issue of harvesting. And there's things that happen before harvesting and things that happen after harvesting. So that need to be brought into the analysis. So that's, I guess I'm just describing all the work that has to happen before we, in order to be able to incorporate the agency of non-humans into the analysis. So so we haven't addressed it, but we're kind of doing the homework to address it, if you want to put it that way. Yeah. Not very satisfying, I'm sure.
Xavier?
Hi there, Javier, Mark, thank you so much for joining us for this talk. This question is for Mark. First, I want to say good morning, and the forest looks nice now that the sun is finally out, in comparison to earlier when it was dark outside. But I was wondering, do you ever present this research at forums with these actors you speak of so they can better coordinate their agendas or streamline some of their processes? And if yes, what have their reactions been? Because I imagine that some of these actors may not even realize or can't visualize how they fit like as a node in these networks. And if they could see that, perhaps they'd be able to get stuff done faster or in an easier way.
I love this question. This is an awesome question. I will note that you do see those big trees behind me. Those are second growth redwoods out here in the Bay Area, because the miners and when all the Europeans came over, they cut down all the old growth around here. But those are big, huge second growth redwoods with coastal fog. So it's really nice. The redwoods, even though they're only about 150 years old, are still huge. So I am deeply engaged with stakeholders in both San Francisco Bay around climate adaptation and sea level rise, and in the Delta around science governance. They have two reactions. One is when I show them the network pictures, is they say, "Yep, that's my life. Thank you for acknowledging it." So it's like they recognize, at least to some level, that they're operating in a really messy situation. And you're almost like a psychologist saying, it's okay, it's messy, and that's kind of how it's supposed to be. And now let's figure out how to move forward. They also appreciate like seeing the pictures. Like, this is a place where I think network visualization is actually helpful. Not necessarily in the details, sometimes in the details, but I think more bigger, it's like, oh, we have to think of the system. Let's start thinking about the system. There's all these other forums. There's all these other actors. We need to think about how we're going to link with these and get out of our little bubble that we're working in, because we know we're interdependent with all of these other people. And then after they kind of say, oh, that's my life, it's messy, and oh, thanks for showing us the system, we feel better, then they turn to me and say, hey, what do we do about this? How do we fix this? How do we navigate this mess effectively? And that is when the responsibility comes back to people like myself and Xavier about how do we bring our academic expertise to bear on this in a reasonable way, not just study these systems, but actually do something to help them build the cooperation, solve these collective action problems. And I feel like I'm actually, in these areas, I'm actually making a pretty big difference. I'm interacting directly at the highest level with the highest level leadership, you know, the people in the networks and the core of these networks. Like, I literally have a meeting after this, working on the recommendations for the regional climate adaptation plan for the Bay Area, about how to organize the science within that, to be able to integrate all the different scientific efforts in a way that and translate them into decision makers. So that's like one of the important things. I've done some work like identifying the 7 core governance challenges that I think you need to solve to be able to kind of get these systems to start moving forward. And yeah, I mean, I feel very happy right now with my engagement, because people call me up and they value the academic expertise that I've had developed over the last 20 years. They think I have something to say. So yeah, so I think it's not just an academic exercise, and it's really fun to do it, to engage with these people. I'm sure Xavier will say the same thing about working with the confederations. Is, you know, at least in the Bay Area, the people that are working on these issues, they're super smart. They're very interesting people. They're leaders. It's just really an interesting thing to do.
Thank you.
Mark, I want to come back to this question, but let me call on Victoria, because Professor Victoria Beard has to run at 11:30. Victoria?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for 2 super interesting talks, and thank you, Linda, for hosting this. I have a couple quick questions. One is, it's just so interesting to hear so many references to Elinor Ostrom, because I had the pleasure of hosting her for a few days at UC Irvine. I used to teach at UC Irvine before I moved to Cornell, and her work has been, like so many people, has been so influential to my own work over the past 20 years. But but I haven't worked in this area. I was very interested in her work and how it informed community-based planning, because I essentially saw community-based planning as a collective action problem. And so her work, and I think there was a reference earlier to Gibson's work, and Arun Agarwal, I don't think has been referenced today. All of them seem to be articulating so clearly, like the theoretical terms, the variables that I thought would be so interesting to look at in urban areas, and how, so for example, like I was listening to the conversation before this started. So think about, especially when they were working at more of maybe the community or village level in natural resource management, to me, I was like, oh, this is so interesting when you think about neighborhoods or informal settlements, you know, how people are gonna organize for urban services. So it's kind of like this weird bridge that I was trying to make. But then, so I haven't really tracked so well this literature on how it gets scaled up. I have actually one of her papers, I think it's like the 2010 paper sitting on my desk right now. I was trying to reread it and get into this literature more. But I guess I'm wondering, is there either a piece that she's written, or maybe you've written, Xavier, that sort of, if you're thinking about, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Agarwal piece that was published in World Development in 2001, that like really listed, it compared like her work, Wade's work, all these people's, and it sort of had very clear variables. If you were looking at like a local level, you know, you'd want to look at boundaries, you'd want to look at group size, you'd want to look at diversity. It was just so easy then to say, okay, this gives me something really clear to test. Has anybody done that work where maybe you would look at that at the community level, and then look at that like at the level of municipality, and look at a regional level? Has somebody articulated maybe like the central variables that one, so are they different? Has someone articulated it? And then I guess as I was listening to all of you talk, I've always kind of wondered, because I work a bit in water and sanitation, and it seems that certain sectors, because Linda's like, oh, you know, there's health, there's this or that, there's all these different sectors, and I've also often wondered, do we have to theorize those variables differently if we're looking at different sectors like water versus fisheries? And it's just so interesting. I was thinking about her earlier work that she spoke about when I met her about police forces, like years and years and years, decades ago. She worked on police forces. And I was just even wondering, like, with the social justice issues that Linda's asking, you know, just how we rethink policing, like, would that work even be relevant today, thinking about, anyway, so just as you think across, you know, everything is diverse as fish to police, how are the variables the same or should they be different? Sorry, it's a long question. There's a lot in there, but I really appreciate your talks.
I can take it on first and then Mark. So yeah, so that paper that you referenced, 2001 by Arun Agrawal, he was taking, you know, the variables that seem to be conducted for successful collective action, from Wade, from Ostrom, from Balandon Plateau, and Agrawal was critiquing the plurification of variables explaining success, and arguing for the type of work that now it's taking place, of which Mark is an example, that arguing for the need to have time series or increase replication so that, you know, it's not case studies that are informing the theory. I know there's so concretely answering to your question of a paper, I think the paper might be just coming because Arun Agrawal is organizing a special issue on PNAS that is going to come out next year, most likely, of a series of papers on common pool resource theory. And it's a direct response to that paper that you cite. You know, how do we move away from case studies informing common pool resource theory? We need more systematic, over time studies. And so there's several papers that are gonna address that. Some are using experimental methods, some are using, I understand, long-term studies now. So then you will have the paper that you're looking for. The other thought I have for you is there is a very interesting documentary that one of Ostrom's former students just produced, Barbara Allen, Carleton College in Minnesota, and it's now available in PBS. So I can send you the title, but that's useful to understand also the progression of the theoretical work that you're interested in catching up on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yati, I'm going to call in, but you're shifting directions. So let me get back one question to Mark on the possibility of institutional change, and the second question being very important when they look at us and say, well, what do we do about this messiness? And as I think one of your papers said, the messiness is not necessarily clear whether less messy is better than messy, because if you just consolidate it into a single one, the lack of redundancy opens itself to new risks. And I was reflecting on, when I get over the PTSD of my dissertation, I will write a paper comparing the Southeast Florida and Bay Area climate adaptation. And they are just almost exactly the same population, a number of municipalities, really big challenges. And in the Bay Area, you have these big institutions. There's a lot of regulatory heft and institutional strength that exists to govern climate adaptation. The 4 major agencies, how they cover the 9 areas. There's regulations at the state level that require things to happen at the local level. And then a lot of conflict, just a lot of big personalities that just don't get along, that constrains some of the softer cooperation that might happen given that there are strong institutions. Then in the Southeast Florida context, you have very weak institutions, no state mandates, no regional entities that cover the same geography. no major mandates, but very strong soft side cooperation among primarily women leaders who are in this region who have sustained leadership over a period of 10 years. So very different cooperation models and institutions. And yet, in a way, the same dynamics seem to be unfolding. And I recognize that changing the ship is very hard for any metropolitan area, given the much even broader structures that we have in terms of political economy and all of that. But yet, given these very different arrangements, if people look at me and say, what did you learn from these different cases? Should we change our institutional structure some way? Should we engage in learning and coordination in a different way? When I look at these two regions, nobody is necessarily really changing organizationally, institutionally, how we develop or plan or do what we need to do to adjust to climate change. And so I'm curious what you are finding in terms of your research, whether the network analysis model is more indicative of the kinds of change that needs to come out of what you're finding.
Well, there's a lot to say in response to that. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's crucial that sort of comparisons, those are really needed, because that helps us understand, what the overall theory should be. So we need a theory that's able to capture not only Southeast Florida, but also the Bay Area, as far as like what we expect for the structure of cooperation, the structure of the institutions, how things are going to change over time. So the only way we're really going to come up with that theory is to observe enough places. They have kind of the same underlying problem, but the governance system is different. Also in Southeast Florida, the threat of sea level rise is much larger. They've had big storms, so that comes into the equation as well. There's already sunny day flooding in Southeast Florida, so those are things to think about. But on the ecological side, so those are all really important. So the network analysis point, yeah, I mean, you can use network analysis in all of these systems, and I do think it's one way to, it's not the only way for sure, but it is one way to measure and visualize and characterize these systems. And there are structural differences and ways to compare networks across multiple systems that I think is a useful perspective. But also the qualitative part, getting into it qualitatively is important. And then the last point, are things really changing? I guess I would argue with you a little bit on that. There's definitely stuff happening. There's local governments that are implementing infrastructure projects at a certain rate. There are new forums, like if you look at the Bay Area, there's a massive explosion in new forums that came up as a function of the attention to sea level rise, and that I'm participating in yet another one. And that process of institutional creation is still going on, and it is messy, but that messiness is healthy in a lot of ways. Like, democracy is messy. If you didn't have a system that was able to creatively make new institutions to respond to new collective action problems, that would be a system that's failing. So you actually want a system that's able to produce messy institutions. The trick is to do it in a way that they coordinate and kind of like are able to work together to solve the collective action problems. So the alternative of no institutional creation and no mess is definitely not a good one. And I think also the alternative of just a completely centralized system is also not a good one. So it's somewhere in between nothing and massive centralization that is good, but what that means varies across context. And we have no idea, in my opinion, what the rules are that would say, in this context, we want this much, or in this type of polycentricity. You're seeing in Southeast Florida, they're coming up with solutions that work, given their institutional context. In Bay Area, they're coming up with a set of solutions that they try to work within theirs. And so, yeah, I just think we just don't have the theory to tell us the answers to those questions yet.
All right, that leads really nicely to Yating's question. Yating, do you want to answer or ask it?
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for sharing your findings about California, about the Bay Area and Florida. That's like very related to my second question. And thank you, Professor Basurto and Professor Lubell, for the excellent presentations. My first question is like what roles does public play in the ecology of games in Professor Lubell's work? So I found it like a lot related to the different cooperatives, different institutions and the government entities, but I don't see a lot like about public. Could you please elaborate like what role do they play? And also among public, actually, there are some people do care about the commons policy and some people do not care at all. So like how like can you say something about that? And the second question is like the ecology of game system would be different in different governance structures, like at least like what I was thinking, maybe different like in the top-down governance and the bottom-up governance, also in different cultures, like culture in the US also versus culture in African countries where maybe there is a tribe or there is some like a very family rooted cultures. So if you have any findings to share. Thank you.
Well, I'll talk about the public, and I'd also like to hear what Javier says about the public. So there's two main ways that I think the public plays a role here. One is that when you look in the ecology of games, kind of all the forums and there's actors, within that, there's a lot of community-based organizations, a lot of NGOs that represent disadvantaged communities or other sort of citizen groups. And usually they're like these organized NGOs that are participating as environmental groups or whatever in these forums, participating in the discussion, and they're recognized as valuable. You know, like the Bay Area, the Bay Adapt process that I'm participating in right now, like we purposely centered environmental justice and community-based organizations right up front. So we really tried to invite them to have a higher rate of participation. So there's that kind of like representation. So, and sometimes there's individual citizens that show up at these things, or individual like environmental justice leaders, but for the most part, I would argue it's kind of these organizations that do it. And then so the first way is organizational. The second way is I heard this all the time from elected officials. It's like, we are constrained by what our citizens think is important. So if they think adapting to climate change is important, then we're on board. So the broader context of public awareness and civic engagement of individuals working with elected officials, and the elected officials' view of that is definitely a constraint on what people can do. And you see, you know, I think Southeast Florida is a good example, and other places in the East Coast is the Bay Area is blessed in some ways by pretty much everybody believes climate change is real. You go to places in the East Coast, there's especially in the Southeast, there's people that, despite the fact that things are flooding already, they think climate change isn't real and they can't do anything about it. So the elected officials are constrained by that. So there's definitely differences. So the political culture thing across countries and levels of development is absolutely crucial. I think there's a lot Javier probably has something to say about this. There's a lot of discussion about like like Latino culture versus Anglo culture, the way that they approach a collective action problem. There's cultural differences that people talk about, like Asian cultures versus others in terms of how they think about collective versus individuals. And I think that's important. We definitely, I think in developing countries, like in the work in Argentina, suggests that institutional development is often ephemeral. So there's like a new problem, like for example, in the Paraná right now, it's burning. It's this massive fire down there that's burning a huge amount of the area. And that's happened before. And what Ramiro showed is that the system kind of responds and it's like, oh, we got to do something about it. They all get together, create new forums, and then those forums disappear. So they're very ephemeral. In the United States, people, where good, better at institutional strength is there, it's more institutionally developed, people get together, they create new forums, and the chance that those forums actually survive and lead to real change is higher. So I think, those are some important differences, and I'd love to hear what Javier says about the public bit.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe the place to start for me is to remind us that the public is us, right? And as Mark was saying, a lot of things happen in relation to the public. Like, public officials respond to what the public think is in their interest. The other is to remind ourselves that Hardin made no space for the public. In his ideas, there was no space for us, the citizenry, to solve collective action problems. Everything had to be left to the state or to the market. And so that is also in us to allow for that to happen. And so public choice is about how much the public engage with the issues. And so I think that leads us to very current issues of information and disinformation and how folks get information about what are those issues, because that is going to start affecting what politicians respond to, whether the citizenry is more informed, has more agency. So those are maybe theories of communication, and the politics of communication and information start to have very important links to collective action issues, whether it's at the local level or at the collective choice level where decision making is happening. So I think that is something that social media and the politics of social media and issues that are very current, we should start reflecting more how that is going to affect the involvement of citizenry in what issues are of importance. I mean, climate change is a clear one, right? But it's just going to increase. So that's one thought. And then the cultural layers of how we view the example of Latin America, it's the welfare of the group versus the welfare of the individual in other cultures are also affecting these issues, of course. But I think that's very current, the politics of information and disinformation. We should be more reflective on how we bring them into our theories and our frameworks of collective action.
I want us to be able to finish at around 11:50 because we have a department town hall at 12 o'clock. But to just quickly summarize Alvieno's question, which ties very much into your last comment, Javier, around disinformation and information. You guys are doing such incredible research, pulling together the actual actions on the ground among very different players and trying to synthesize that. And at the same time, there is so much information that is actually live and happening in Twitter and real, news media and all other fora that actually does not present any sense of a desire to engage in a collective commons. And that's true not only in the United States, but in many places that are fraught by populism and an internal politics that are very divisive. And so Alvieno, your question is asking about a software of, can you easily represent this information? But I would broaden that question to be a bit even broader, rather than just specific to these, the specific relationships, but demonstrating what are connecting the citizenry of how do you express the true values that people actually have in order to communicate to the public sector so that they can then respond. What is the technological side of that or the politics of that? How do you actually enable that from the bottom to the top, linking those, but then also across these agencies, for the woman from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, for all the actual actors who are out there who need to know, like, who is doing something somewhere else. Oftentimes you just have no idea because you're working in your own silo. Is this, again, a technological thing where if you had a fora, everybody's mapping out, to some extent that is the internet? What is it that we're looking for that would help us to communicate better?
You want to take it, Mark?
Well, I mean, we have done some, you can do some interactive networks that people can point and click using like R Shiny and stuff like that. So I think that's something that's cool to do. I have a paper under review in Nature Sustainability of Tiffany Morrison that we call Navigating Polycentric Governance. And that paper basically kind of goes through like a handbook for navigating these systems that I think that I tried to make so that I could hand to somebody like the woman from California Department of Fish and wildlife and say, hey, we know the system is messy. Here's the things you ought to think about to be able to get what you need done in this system. So it's got a theory thing to it, but it's also got kind of a practice-based goal to it. And there's a figure in there that I am trying to convince the reviewers of this paper and anybody else who might want to answer that you ought to take the figure from this paper, and everybody working these systems should paste it next to their computers so that any given time they can stare at and have like a cheat sheet for navigating these systems. So that's one thing that I'm doing along those lines to help people.
We're at 1 minute. You tell me, Linda.
Go ahead, if you can offer our final remarks here.
Well, no, not for final remarks, but just to share some more thoughts. You know, I think this time's call for rethinking how collaboration among agencies is going to work when we're doing more Zoom. And here I'm going back to this finding from the collective action literature that face-to-face communication really builds trust and reciprocity. So I think now that we're interacting less face-to-face, how is that going to affect trust and reciprocity in interagency coordination and cooperation, right? Is Zoom going to be affecting only these junior positions that haven't been interacted face-to-face before? Because it's not affecting those that are in more senior positions that know each other and we can do Zoom from a distance. But those entry-level positions that haven't been socialized into a culture of collaboration interagencies, I think those issues are going to have to be re-examined in the policy literature to understand how these issues affect collaboration or not. So that's what I was thinking when you were sharing your thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you both so much for taking time to be with us at Cornell today. It's been a really wide-ranging and enriching conversation. Delightful to talk with both of you, and I hope that we'll be able to continue to engage with these literatures and with each of you moving forward. If I could ask everyone to unmute their mics and then give them a round of applause, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.